And I said, okay, well, maybe we could talk about that another time. And she said, you're just like Hitler. There are few conversations as difficult as those about Israel-Palestine, particularly among Jews. That's because what we say and do matters deeply. It bears on the kinds of relationships and communities we create, the kind of policy we advocate, the kind of futures we imagine for ourselves and our children. These are difficult and very important conversations, and I think we're all here because of the importance of this conversation. But let us remember that no one has a monopoly on virtue or passion or commitment. I'm going to say that again. No one has a monopoly on virtue or passion or commitment. I can't think of two better people to help us start this conversation, this work, than Rabbi Brant Rosen and Lynn Pollack. Rabbi Rosen will speak first. Brant Rosen is a founding member of Jewish Voice for Peace's Rabbinic Council. He was recently a congregational rabbi for 20 years, and now is regional director for the esteemed and venerable peace organization, American Friends Service Committee. His writing is an inspiration. This fall, in the wake of my conversation with my mother, struggling to reconcile myself as Hitler, I found his sermon, God is Close to the Brokenhearted, and it really spoke to me as both the brokenhearted here thinking about what's happening in Israel-Palestine and those much more directly affected by the crisis, particularly in Gaza, that in a way God or holiness or spirit is closest to us when we engage with the very issues we're here to engage with. Lynn Pollack has been a founding member of Jewish Voice for Peace Chicago. She's traveled to the Middle East several times. Her life, as she described it, has been transformed by this activism. She was the very first person to come help us midwife our little organization into existence this summer. And we're very pleased to have both of these speakers here. So here's Brant Rosen. Brant will start and talk. He'll be followed by Lynn, and then I'll come back and moderate, and we'll take questions. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So I want to first thank you for coming. I want to thank Rachel and Lorraine and the leaders of the brand new JVP-Milwaukee for having Lynn and I, and for coming together at large. I was thrilled to hear that Milwaukee was gaining a JVP chapter. JVP has been a very important and precious institutional address for me for several years, and for a rapidly growing number of Jews around the country and really around the world. And it's been inspiring to see the growth of this movement, and especially in our own Midwest backyard. So it's really an honor, and I know I speak for Lynn too when I say it's an honor to be able to be part of your inaugural kickoff program. It's truly humbling. I also am very honored to be sharing the podium with Lynn. Lynn is a very dear friend. I'll just say also a congregant of mine, a member of my congregation, and has been involved in this work much longer than I will tell you. And when I look back on my own trajectory, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, into my own coming to this work, Lynn was patiently waiting for me to come to the place where I am, and was very helpful and kind as a congregant, but also as my own teacher in helping me wrestle and grapple with what it means to do peace and justice work on behalf of Palestinians the way we do on behalf of all oppressed peoples around the world. So it's always a pleasure to be working alongside Lynn. Rachel, it's painful to hear the story about your conversation with your mother. And, I hear this over and over again. I hear from congregants and just friends about how this issue isn't only a wedge issue in our community, it is literally estranging family members from one another. And I want to maybe unpack a little bit why that might be, and also offer some hope in ways that some of these wedges are slowly starting to be less impactful, I think. I think the growth of an organization like JVP is really a bellwether of that. When you mentioned your conversation with your mother, it made me think of some of the arguments I used to have with my parents about Israel when I was younger, especially when I was an undergraduate student, a strident undergraduate student. And really, I would call myself, for most of my life, a liberal Zionist, a progressive Zionist, but still troubled by many things that Israel would do. And I remember some very, very painful conversations that I just decided to avoid with my parents. But however, and here's a little hopeful sign that if my parents can come around, I remember very vividly when I started to speak more forcefully on behalf of Palestinians. This was during Operation Cast Lead, which was a very important breaking point for me, December 2008, January 2009. And on Yom Kippur, in fact, that's why I thought of this, my parents were visiting me. They were attending services of my congregation for high holidays. And I'd written an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, which was condemning Israel's military onslaught on Gaza during Operation Cast Lead and calling for the community to take seriously the findings of the Goldstone report, which had just been released around that time. And I had written stuff like that up until that point, but somehow when you write it in the Chicago Tribune in paper, it causes much more upheaval. At any rate, I knew it was gonna come, but it was it came out Erev Yom Kippur, the morning of Erev Yom Kippur, and I was reading it, and my mother came downstairs, and I said, "Oh, look here, read this. Look what's in the paper." And she read it, and I said, "And so, what do you think?" And I sort of took a breath, and she said, "Well, I think you said what needs to be said." And I knew she said that not knowing that she didn't agree with everything I wrote, and maybe some of it was, she was proud of her son, the rabbi, but I think most of it was a sign that things are becoming, getting to the point where we need to really learn how to have the conversation with one another. And I just took that one moment, I think I'll probably always remember it, as a hopeful sign that we're learning how to have this conversation in our own families and in our own community as well. It does not mean it's going to be easy. It's still enormously difficult. But in my experience, in my own anecdotal experience, admittedly, I think the Jewish community is painfully starting to broaden the parameters of what is considered acceptable discourse on the issue of Israel-Palestine. And as painful as it is, I see that as a very important and hopeful sign for our community and for the cause of justice for Palestinians as well as Israelis. I'll say just a few words about myself and a little bit about what was advertised, which is to talk a little bit about the challenges that face Jewish advocates who stand in solidarity with Palestinian in their struggle for human and civil rights. So, as I said, I come from a pretty average middle-class Jewish upbringing. I identify as a Zionist for pretty much most of my life. I first visited Israel when I was a young boy. The narrative, the Zionist narrative, the Israel narrative, has always been very integral to my own Jewish identity, as it is for many American Jews, and in fact many Jews around the world. And I often say that Zionism and the Israel narrative has a kind of sacred power for Jews, even those who don't define themselves as religious. It's a redemptive kind of story, right? The story of a persecuted people, persecuted and hounded throughout the centuries around the world, who finally became, as the national anthem of Israel would have it, Am Chofshi Be'artzenu, a free people in our own land, out of the ashes of the Holocaust, returning to their ancestral homeland, and creating a modern nation state there. It is a powerful, powerful narrative that has a sacred power. And I identified, as many, very, very deeply with that narrative. And without going into too much detail, I'll say that I considered moving to Israel at one point. I was very involved on my college campus at UCLA in organizing on behalf of Israel. I identified largely as a progressive Zionist. I was very involved in the peace movement, Shalom Akshav. I thought about moving to kibbutz. I spent almost 2 years on a kibbutz and considered joining a Garin, a group of Americans that were moving there. And for all kinds of complicated reasons, did not do that and decided to become a rabbi instead, much to the puzzlement of my parents and loved ones and Hebrew school teachers. And but I still, after that, always really, I think, identified with Israel in many, many ways, and have visited there more often than I could count at this point. At the same time, I will say that as much as I cherish the Zionist narrative, there were always nagging questions that sort of gnawed at me over the years that I did a good job of quelling. There were a variety of them. And again, we can talk about this more during question and answer. Some of it had to do with the circumstances of the creation of the state that involved what I would call the ethnic cleansing of its indigenous people. That's something I say very easily now, but I probably would have said, well, this complicated and unfortunate circumstance that occurred when, as all nations do, that there's messiness when nation states are created. I did my best not to think too much about that. Even when the Israeli new historians were starting to publish their accounts, and we were receiving them in English, where it became pretty clear that the traditional narrative, the traditional Zionist narrative of how Israel was founded in historic Palestine, was not as the mythic Israeli narrative would have it. I did my best to quell those kinds of thoughts with, well, it's very, very complicated. You know, that's a good liberal mantra. It's complicated. And the other main questions had to do with the notion of creating an ethnically Jewish nation state itself. And I remember distinctly thinking about this and having conversations about this, that the notion that we could create a nation state that was predicated on the identity of one people, one ethnicity or faith tradition, in a part of the world, in a land that has historically been multi-ethnic and multi-faith, and how you can square that circle. How can you create a truly democratic society as it purports to be when you have a Jewish state that's founded in a place that is so diverse as historic Palestine? And again, the more I would try to pull on that thread, I think I would start to see the whole sweater start to unravel. So I would stop pulling to say, well, it's complicated. You know, Israel is Jewish and democratic, and we need to continue to advocate for that. But never completely satisfied with that. I guess finally, one of the biggest issues I had was the overall militarism of Israeli society in general. I've always considered myself, and these are values I really can direct right back to my own parents, have been strongly identified as part of the peace movement in this country, and consider myself to be a peace activist and anti-militarism in all kinds of ways. And you know, that when I look at the way our country has intervened militarily around the world, I have no hesitation in protesting that. I never have, as many Jews don't. And yet, when it comes to Israeli militarism, you know, and Israel is one of the most militarized countries in the world, I always reflexively gave Israel a pass. I always would find myself apologizing for Israeli militarism in ways that I would never apologize for American militarism or militarism in general. And, you know, I would quell those thoughts with, well, it's a dangerous neighborhood, you know, which I identify that response now as a very colonial response. Well, Israel is surrounded by very dangerous folks, and Israel needs to be dismilitarized in order to survive. Which to me raises the other question of, if Israel was created to keep Jews safe, then why did they created in a place that would invariably engender conflict and necessitate such an over-militarized country in the first place. So again, it's complicated, right? Anyways, those are just a few. I could list more, but the way I describe it in my writing and on my blog and eventually in my book was that I was sort of a line of dominoes that I lined up over the years, and really Operation Cast Lead was the little domino that finally tipped them all down, and I really couldn't stay silent about my consideration of these questions anymore. And that was a moment when Lynn said, was waiting there to welcome me with open arms, to say, welcome to the movement. And what I decided to do, and when I came out and started to write very forcefully about these questions, I had been in my congregation for over 10 years. I wrote on my blog very forcefully about what Israel was doing in Gaza, and then started to write about other things as well. But I began to what I called in the title of my book, Wrestle in the Daylight. In other words, just try to talk about how I felt about what was going on and do it in the context of a blog where I could have conversation. And I was very proud, I have to say, and continue to be, of the blog, because many of my own congregants would weigh in, and some of them who disagreed with me forcefully, but others who agreed with me, and many people who were enormously relieved that either their rabbi or a rabbi was actually saying these things, because they identified very deeply as Jews, but felt kept at bay about identifying in the larger sense in the Jewish community because of their feelings about Israel, and that Israel is somehow, that towing the line in Israel and Zionism was somehow a necessary aspect of being part of the Jewish community. So it was really uncharted waters for me. I didn't know if I would, at the beginning, if I would be able to keep my job as a rabbi. I didn't know if I didn't even really know what it meant to be Jewish and be saying these things, to be honest. But very quickly I realized that for me it was the most Jewish thing I could do. And I do deeply believe that standing up alongside people who are oppressed is a deeply Jewish thing to do. It comes from our sacred tradition. It comes directly from the most central story, the Exodus story, that teaches us that God stands with the oppressed and calls for their liberation and demands that we do the same. It comes from a tradition of wrestling and debate and struggle and having painful conversations. The most central text of our tradition, the Talmud, is nothing if not a grand debate over centuries that continues really to this day about issues of deepest importance. And to somehow say we can have all of these debates, but when it comes to this issue, namely the issue of Israel-Palestine, there are certain things that can and cannot be said, strikes me as profoundly not Jewish. Now, I respect that there are those who don't agree with what I say in my community, and that's as it should be. But at the very least, we need to find a way to have this conversation and to widen the discourse of what is considered acceptable conversation and debate on the issue of Israel-Palestine. Zionism is very important to many Jews. There's no question. Jewish nationalism, Jewish ethnic nationalism. However, Zionism is a political movement that's relatively recent in Jewish history. It emerged in the 19th century Europe. Nationalism itself is a modern concept. So to equate Judaism ipso facto with Zionism, I think, is intellectually and historically inaccurate, and I also think it's invoked in ways that have a very dangerous dampening effect on the vibrancy of our community. It used to be, back in the early days of Zionism, Zionism was one of many movements of Jewish modernity, and it was debated very vigorously with other movements. And there were fine, upstanding members of the Jewish community, the Reform movement being a classic example of it, who were opposed to Zionism and were very much part of this discourse. After the emergence of the State of Israel, For a period, that conversation continued. A great example of that is Martin Buber, who was strongly and publicly against the formation before 1948 of an singularly ethnically Jewish state in Palestine. But once it was founded, made his peace with the fact that Israel is a reality, but this conversation still needs to happen. And if you read his writings, post-1948, he's an example of, I think, a very venerable Jewish figure who was able to model having this conversation. But increasingly, the notion of either being strongly critical of Israel, of American policy towards Israel, or even for people who do not consider themselves to be Zionists at all, but still out of a sense of strong Jewish imperative. In other words, part of this history of people who see being Jewish as something other than affirming nation-statism and ethnic nationalism has been considered an anathema in the Jewish establishment. And that has kept some of our best and brightest from participating in Jewish life. I know this for a fact. I meet them all the time. Many of them are young people, but they're not just young people. There's certainly a growing number of younger generations of Jews who don't share the same assumptions about the centrality of Israel and their Jewish identity as previous generations. But I have to say, as I've done this work and gotten more involved in Palestinian solidarity, I've met many older adults who have been heartbroken that they want to identify as Jews, they want to participate as Jews, they want to become part of synagogues and be openly participating in Jewish life, but for the issue of Israel, which has become this gatekeeper kind of cause that has kept them out. There have been attempts throughout history and recent history in creating space, and most of them have crashed and burned. Back in the early 70s, there was, some of you may be aware of the group Rabbi that tried to create this progressive Jewish voice. It was effectively crushed by the Jewish establishment of the time. You may remember in the 1980s New Jewish Agenda, which was another attempt at widening that discourse. But again, any New Jewish Agenda folks out there? No? Yeah. Did not last long either. But I'm happy to say that Jewish Voice for Peace, and maybe it's a timing thing, maybe it was just a question of until its time had come. The fact that Jewish Voice for Peace is thriving and growing so vigorously is a harbinger that we're ready to be able to have this conversation. Now, I say that advisedly. There are many in the Jewish establishment world, and by that I mean the large Jewish institutions, large Jewish organizations, and also many mainstream synagogues who will tell you that Jewish Voice for Peace are just simply beyond the pale. There are those who consider J Street beyond the pale. J Street recently tried to become part of the American Council, the Council of Presidents, and was rebuffed. So this is what we're going up against. We're going up against, I think, in my opinion, a Jewish leadership orthodoxy that realizes its time is, its relevancy is quickly coming to an end, and they're lashing out. They see the writing on the wall. They read the surveys that say fewer and fewer young Jewish people identify with Israel the same way. And there's a kind of a desperation to these attempts to keep this conversation from happening, but I don't think it's a conversation that can be quelled at this point. Which is why, for me, JVP has been so enormously important, and it gives me a Jewish institutional home where I don't think there would be one otherwise. I helped found the Rabbinical Council. We have almost 50 rabbis on our council, and compared to the number of American rabbis, it's admittedly a drop in the bucket. However, I know there are many rabbis out there who ideologically would absolutely join the JVP Rabbinical Council but can't for professional reasons because they know they would lose their job if they publicly identify themselves as such. And that's something that's a phenomenon we can talk about as well during the conversation. So that brings me full circle to JVP and the importance of this movement and the importance of this organization, not only for widening the conversation in the Jewish community, but also providing a place where Jews who want to become part of this growing movement of solidarity with Palestinians who are seeking true justice for Palestinians in the time-honored way that progressive activists, progressive popular activists have behaved, which is standing alongside the oppressed and demanding their dignity and their civil rights and their full human rights alongside people of privilege like us. And JVP gives us the opportunity to do that unabashedly and openly as Jews. And for that, I think it's one of the most important new Jewish organizations in our country today. So that brings me to about half an hour, and that also brings me to Lynn, who will tell you, I think, more about JVP. She has a much longer history with them, and there's a wealth of information about the evolution of JVP up until today. I'll come back and rejoin her at the end of her talk, and I look forward to having a conversation with you all. Thank you again.